They laughed when they saw his face. "Isn't that the guy from TV?" Cameras rolled. The militia circled. Steve Harvey, tied to a post in the middle of the jungle, thought it was a prank. Until the guns clicked. "This one's worth millions," the leader grinned. They planned ransom, exposure, fame. But what they didn't know, what they never planned for, was that someone had already crossed the perimeter, and he didn't make a sound. Harvey tried to reason. "You got the wrong man. I host shows, not wars." The men laughed louder. "That's why they'll pay." One pressed a camera close. Smile. But night was falling fast, and their arrogance cast long shadows. In the bush behind the camp, leaves didn't rustle. Footsteps left no echo. A silent figure knelt, observing every corner of the compound. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for one man. Steve had no idea. Inside the hut, Steve heard them planning the video. One would read demands. One would send it to the embassy. Steve's voice trembled. "You really think this is gonna work?" They smirked. "It already has." Meanwhile, a guard at the gate checked his watch. The time was wrong. So was the silence. A hand reached up, lightning quick, and in seconds, the radio was dead. So was the threat. One by one, the outposts failed. Generators flickered. Flashlights dimmed. No one shouted. No gunfire. Only confusion. "Check the north fence," someone muttered, but no one returned. In the darkness, boots moved like breath. No orders, no sound. Only presence. And behind it all, a mind that didn't need volume to be heard. Inside, Steve watched the camera's red light blink. The man holding it said, "Smile, rich man. Your audience awaits." But the lens caught something else, a shadow in the trees. Still, waiting, watching. Steve didn't see it, but soon he'd never forget it. If you think this story should be heard, subscribe now. Your support makes these voices louder without raising the volume. The leader stepped out to check on the gate. He found it empty. Just a rifle leaning against a tree still warm. He turned, confused, and never saw the figure above. He dropped silently. Back inside, someone radioed him. No reply. Steve, now alone with two men, felt the tension shift. They looked nervous. He felt it. The jungle wasn't quiet anymore. It was focused. Another man vanished. No cries, no struggle. Just missing. One guard shouted, "It's the army." But there were no trucks. No orders. Only fear. Then Steve whispered, "You all feeling that? Like someone's watching, but not blinking?" The younger guard nodded, but the older one only said, "We shouldn't have touched this one." Steve asked, "Who? What do you mean?" The man replied, "This land, it listens. And when it gets quiet like this, someone's already inside." Steve raised an eyebrow. "Y'all got jungle ghosts?" But deep down, he knew this wasn't fiction. Even the bugs stopped chirping. Even the fire crackled softer. And far beyond the light, a blade slid from a sleeve, not to kill, to end a threat. One last guard ran. No one followed, because there was no need. At the hut's back wall, a hand reached through a narrow crack. Steve felt something cold touch his wrist. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, a lockpick. The rope fell. And for the first time all night, Steve stopped joking. His breath caught. Whoever this wasn't from the embassy. The door creaked. Steve turned slowly. A figure stepped inside. No words, no mask, only calm. Traoré met Steve's eyes, then glanced at the two guards left inside. Steve whispered, "Hey, man, you good with all this?" Traoré didn't answer. He didn't have to. With 3 steps, it was done. 2 guards disarmed. 1 life restored. And not a single bullet fired. Outside, wind passed through the trees, carrying no sound. Inside, Steve stared at the man who had just untied him. "Who are you?" he whispered. Traoré didn't answer. He pressed a finger to his lips, then handed Steve a scarf. "Put this on," he mouthed. Not to hide, to blend, because this wasn't the end. The rest of the camp still believed they were in control. They moved like shadows. Traoré took the lead, Steve behind. At every corner, another guard asleep. Every step, a lesson in restraint. No flesh, no fight, just disappearance. Steve whispered, "This is unreal." Traoré glanced back, eyes calm, and kept moving. If that moment gave you chills, hit like. There's more silence to come. They reached the southern edge of the camp. Steve's heart pounded louder than their steps. A final guard stood with a cigarette, staring into the dark. Traoré motioned. Steve held his breath. And in a blink, the cigarette fell. The man with it, gone. Not dead, just no longer part of the problem. Beyond the camp, a narrow trail opened into the jungle. Steve turned to speak, but Traoré was already gone. For a second, he thought he'd imagined the whole thing. Then a whisper, "Move." From behind a tree. They weren't safe yet, but they were free. And Steve followed the silence. A mile out, they reached a river. Traoré stopped. "Wait," he said, his first word all night. Steve blinked. "You do talk." Traoré smiled faintly. "Only when I must." Then he knelt by the water, cleaning something from his hands. Steve sat nearby, trying to understand who just saved him, and why he wasn't afraid anymore. Traoré tossed Steve a bottle of water. "Why'd you come here?" Steve laughed dryly. "To tell jokes, film something light." Traoré nodded. "They almost made you a headline." Steve stared at him. "You didn't have to come." "I always come," he said. "Just not always in time." Tonight he was. They camped near a fallen tree, sharing silence more than stories. Steve watched him sharpen a knife not to use, but to prepare. "You military?" Traoré shook his head. "President." Steve almost choked. "Of what?" "Here. Get out of here." "I didn't," Traoré replied. "That's why you're still alive." Steve sat quiet for once. He had questioned so many. But they stayed inside, because next to this man, questions felt like noise. Instead, he said, "If I get home, I'm gonna tell this story." Traoré stood. "Only if you tell it right." Then disappeared into the trees again. By morning, a search team found Steve disoriented but unharmed. No one saw who brought him there. Just tracks that vanished at the waterline. Steve said one thing. A man walked in, alone, didn't fire a shot, didn't even yell, and saved me anyway. Back in the U.S., Steve's team wanted press headlines, TV deals. He said no, not yet, because something about the silence still sat in him, and until he could explain it, he didn't want to speak. He wanted to listen just a little longer. In a quiet studio, Steve recorded a voice memo. Not for TV, not for jokes, just for himself. He didn't speak. "But I heard everything." He replayed that sentence 3 times. Because somehow, that silence still echoed louder than applause ever had. Days passed. Steve watched the footage they'd planned to film smiling faces, upbeat music, scripted laughs. He closed the laptop. None of it mattered now. Because the real story wasn't made for cameras. It was made for memory. He met with a journalist who asked, "Who is this man?" Steve smiled. "You won't find him online. He doesn't tweet, doesn't post, but he walks in where others wouldn't. And when he does, things change." She raised an eyebrow. "Like a myth?" Steve nodded. "No, like a president." He returned to Burkina Faso, not to film, just to walk, to see the road again, to pass the spot where silence had won. Locals whispered his name, not Steve, Traoré, but no one pointed. No one posed. They simply nodded, as if silence itself had passed through. Steve visited a school. A boy drew him a picture. A figure in the jungle, calm, surrounded by fire but untouched. Steve asked, "What's this?" The boy replied, "That's the man who saves people. He doesn't need noise to win." Steve placed the drawing in his notebook. He'd carry it home. Later that day, an old man stopped him. "You were the loud one, right?" Steve laughed. "Still am." The man nodded. "But that night, you weren't." Steve's smile faded. "I didn't need to be." He said more with his silence than I ever did with a microphone. Back home, Steve took the stage again, but something changed. He paused longer, spoke softer, joked less. And when people asked why, he only said, "Sometimes a quiet man shows you how loud your life's been," then moved on to the next story. Then one day, he started writing. Not a book, not a joke. Just words that matched what he felt. A man came in, alone, took nothing, said nothing, and gave me back everything. That was the first line, and he never stopped writing. He wrote through the night, no outline, no filter, just truth. I talk for a living, but that man, he changed my life without moving his lips. He finished the last sentence, then sat in silence, just like Traoré had. Publishers called, TV producers begged, Netflix wanted rights. Steve said no, not until it feels like him, because this wasn't entertainment, it was memory, it was respect. And some stories aren't meant for profit. He recorded a podcast, just one episode, no music, no intro, just his voice. Ibrahim Traoré saved me. But what I saw that night wasn't just rescue, it was something bigger than fear or fame. He mailed the audio to Burkina Faso, no address, just a village name. Inside, a USB drive and a note. If he ever wants to know what his silence sounded like, let him hear this. The post office clerk blinked. "You sure he'll get it?" Steve smiled. He always does. Months passed. Steve was different. Still funny, still loud, but less careless. He listened more, spoke less. And when fans asked, "Why the change?" he answered simply, "Because I once met a man who didn't need to speak to teach me everything." He walked on stage at a leadership summit. No jokes, just presence. He told the story briefly, carefully, and ended with, "I owe him more than my life. I owe him my silence." If this moment made you feel something, leave a like. Let his silence travel further. Back in Burkina Faso, a young man heard the podcast. He recognized the cadence, the weight. He played it for his father. The old man didn't blink. "That's about Traoré," he said. "How do you know?" The old man smiled. "Because I've seen silence work like that before." In the capital, a mural went up overnight. No artist signed it. It showed Traoré not with weapons, but with open hands. Walking alone, at the bottom, he walked in, and we walked out. Steve saw it weeks later, and wept. He finally sat down with a reporter. She asked, "What would you say if you met him again?" Steve paused, looked at the camera, and said, "Nothing, because he already heard me before I knew what I was saying." The interview ended, but Steve didn't move. He sat there, listening to the silence, to the moment, because sometimes the loudest message comes after the mic turns off. At a school in Atlanta, a teacher played Steve's podcast. Kids listened quietly. One asked, "Why didn't the president just send the army?" Another whispered, "Maybe he was the army." The class went silent. Then one girl wrote in her notebook, "Real leaders don't wait for applause." An artist in Brazil painted a comic strip, a man in shadows saving a voice. He called it "The Weapon That Doesn't Speak." He'd never heard of Traoré, only Steve's words. But somehow, it was enough. Silence had gone global. Steve kept getting letters, not just about Traoré, but about quiet fathers, resilient mothers, voiceless activists. People finally seen through someone else's story. He kept everyone. Because they weren't about him, they were echoes. He hosted a special episode just reading those letters. No jokes, no guests, just gratitude. One letter said, "I found myself in your silence. Thank you for giving it a voice." He paused, touched his chest, and said, "I just passed it on." One day, someone asked him, "If that had been someone else, not Traoré, would you be here?" Steve didn't blink. No. They leaned in. Why not? He looked up. "Because I wouldn't have listened." Sometimes it takes silence to make us hear again. He was offered an award, Hero's Voice International Storytelling. He declined. "It doesn't belong to me," he said. "Give it to someone who walks alone and never asks for a stage." They asked for a name. He wrote, "Ibrahim Traoré." At a conference, a speaker quoted the rescue. A man walked in, disarmed everyone, and vanished. People asked, "Was that real?" Steve smiled. "The best things are, you just gotta listen harder." A filmmaker reached out. "Netflix wants your story." Steve said, "It's not mine to sell. I'm just the man who lived it." She replied, "Then tell it right." He nodded. 1 minute at a time. One silence at a time. He returned to Burkina Faso again. This time, not to speak, just to walk. He didn't expect anyone, but at the edge of a forest, a boy stood waiting. "You came back," he said. Steve asked, "How'd you know?" The boy smiled. He did too. They walked a little while, not saying much, just watching leaves fall, birds pass, sunset settle. Steve asked the boy, "Is he still around?" The boy nodded. Not always here, but always listening. Steve smiled. "Me too." Steve sat in his hotel room, no lights on, just replaying the night in his head. Still no footage, still no proof. But somehow, the story felt more real than anything he'd ever broadcast. He whispered to no one, "I hope he knows what he did." Somewhere far someone did. Back in the U.S., students debated it online. Is this real? Why haven't we heard of this man before? Steve didn't respond. He let the silence speak for itself. He knew what mattered most wasn't belief, but reflection. A university professor built a class around the story. Silence as Leadership, it was called. Students wrote essays about trust, timing, restraint. None had met Traoré, but all agreed. Some power doesn't shout, it simply arrives when it's needed most. Steve's show aired a quiet tribute, just his voice, one candle. No graphics. This isn't a story about me. It's about the man who walked in without permission and walked out with my life in his hands. A small village in Burkina Faso built a statue, no name, no plaque, just a silhouette walking forward, locals said. If you know who it is, you understand. If you don't, you're not ready. Years passed. The story changed shape, but never truth. Books used it. Leaders quoted it. And every time someone said, "That sounds too perfect," Steve replied, "So does silence, until it saves you." One day, Steve held a small event. No cameras, no sponsors, just people. Each told a story about someone who walked in when no one else would, and every tale ended the same way. He said nothing, but everything changed. Steve sat on the edge of a quiet stage. He looked into the audience and said, "If this story moved you, let it move forward. Tell someone, not for views, not for fame, but so the next silent hero knows they're not alone. Leave a comment. Share the silence. Be the next echo." That night, Steve walked alone down the street. City noise buzzed around him, but inside, he carried a silence that didn't weigh. It lifted ... He didn't look back. Because some stories don't need to end. They just fade into those ready to carry them. In a small village, a boy tells another boy a tale of a loud man saved by silence, of a leader who walked in and left no trace, except in the hearts of those who saw him. They sit under stars listening, because sometimes a quiet story makes the loudest legacy.